Welcome back to another episode of Hungry for the Word. As always, I'm your host, Tommy Vento, with my lovely co-host, Julie Vento. We spent the last couple episodes talking about Ephesians chapter 4. And so as we were kind of discussing what to talk about in this episode, you had mentioned Melchizedek, something that is mentioned a handful of times. In fact, 10 exactly throughout the word. And that's kind of a lesson in its own right. We'll let each of you read into it what you will. But uh, we wanted to undertake talking about Melchizedek a little bit because Ephesians 4 does such an excellent job of framing up the new life that we live in. And Melchizedek is the new paradigm that we live in, if that makes sense. And so we wanted to undertake that a little bit today. And I suppose we could jump right in unless you have any thoughts before we do.
No, let's jump in.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So our first introduction to Melchizedek is in Genesis chapter 14. Um, this is Abraham, who, for all intents and purposes, is the most important story that's happening in creation as it's going on. He will eventually be, or I guess you could say he already was, even though the fruit wasn't there yet, the father of the faith, and not only the father of the Hebrew people, the Israelites, but ultimately all of us who have come to call on Jesus. Abraham represents our father in some way, shape, or form. And so it's everyone knows the story of Abraham. Well, most
Mm,
everyone, I should say. But what I think is funny is at this point in the story, his name is still Abram. So he's not yet been given a new name by God. And particularly, his name went from Abram to Abraham. It was the hay that was added into his name. And the hay in the Hebrew culture represents the breath of God. And so he had God's life breathed into him. And I think while that's beautiful, it's important to recognize that his encounter with Melchizedek happens before his new name was given. So that's just a little bit of context for he's walking through and uh, in Genesis chapter 14, verse 17 says, after his return from the king, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him, the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley. And then in verse 18, right here, and then King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God the Most High. He blessed Abram and said, blessed be Abram by God Most High, El Elyon in the Hebrew, maker of heaven and earth. And blessed be El Elyon, the God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And right then, Abram gave him 1/10 of everything. And that's it.
mm.
Then the story continues. We don't get another mention of Melchizedek again. And so a couple of thoughts, I think, from this first introduction we have to him. The first is his name. We've learned in the Hebrew that almost everything is in a name. And Melchizedek means king of righteousness. So Melchizedek, who is the king of Salem, which is peace, I think it's amazing that his name is the king of righteousness, who is the king of peace. I just think that's
Mm.
so fun, especially because some of the things that we'll talk about later in this episode, but knowing that beforehand just gives it a little bit of extra zest, in my opinion. And then the second point that I want to point out is there is no lineage, heritage, ancestry, or ancestors mentioned about Melchizedek, which is If you're familiar at all with the Bible, that is wildly unorthodox.
Yeah.
Almost everyone whose name gets mentioned in the Bible, they either mention who that person's father was, or they get mentioned because their kids are being mentioned and their father gets named in it. And so, out of the blue, verse 18 just says, and King Melchizedek of Salem brought out bread and wine. There's no introduction,
Mm.
there's no precursor, there's no lead up to it. And I'll say, reading a little bit deeper, I almost picture this as I have struggled, admittedly, and I would love if one of our listeners could weigh in and maybe uh, I don't even want to say prove me wrong, but help me see it otherwise. But I don't find much mention of Salem in scripture outside of the Psalms. It mentions Salem in the Psalms as peace, but very rarely do we talk about Salem as a location, and especially one that is so important that King Melchizedek comes from there and comes and brings bread and wine and blesses Abram. And Abraham thinks so highly of this that he gives him a tenth of all that he had. And so, this notion of Abram, like I said earlier, being the most important story on the earth at this juncture, he will eventually be the father of Isaac, who will be the father of Jacob, who is Israel. And yet, that almost takes a back seat to King Melchizedek of Salem. So, the king of righteousness, who's the king of peace, walking into his life and blessing him and blessing God. And I don't want to steal Paul's thunder because he says this later in Hebrews and we'll look at it, but he says who is superior? The one giving the blessing or the one being blessed? So clearly Melchizedek has this standing that is over and above Abraham when Abraham is the subject of Genesis for these 13 chapters, you know? And so I don't know, I just think it's fascinating that almost hiding in plain sight, the Lord introduces us to such a holy character for just two brief sentences and then moves on as though nothing happened. And again, I don't want to steal my own thunder. We'll get into that a little bit later too, but
Yeah, I didn't want to steal any thunder, but and we've talked about doing something on this about how Jesus is throughout the Old Testament and just
yes.
type and shadow. And you notice that in this case, Abram at the point doesn't just say, well, who are you? And I mean, he seems to know,
Yep.
and so much so that he gives him a tenth, he gives him a tithe.
Right.
So nobody's surprised except the reader, us, as we're reading through this in the story. But
Very true.
uh, obviously a type and shadow as we get into it of Christ himself, you
Yes,
know.
exactly. And I think that's a good place to sort of transition to the next mention. We're in this episode, we're gonna go through all 10 mentions of Melchizedek. Since there are only 10, we figured we might as well cover all those bases. The second mention comes in Psalm 110 in the Psalms. And Psalm 110 specifically is another one of those very fun, very mysterious, very paradoxical mysteries of the kingdom that has several truths and layers depending on which point in all of chronological order you decide to look at it from. And so it's more or less it's this overarching vision of who Jesus is and will be, all of Psalm 110. But then it says in verse 4, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. And so I'm picturing a young man Jesus when I'll say the spirit hadn't fully taken effect and rooted yet in the way that we understand it, that he's reading this, and I imagine the question of the order of who? Like that's not someone who's given preeminence throughout the word. It's not someone who anyone anywhere has mentioned you should strive to be like this. And yet I think you hit the nail on the head perfectly. It's sort of this precursor to who Jesus is. And gosh, we really should do an episode on Jesus in the Old Testament, although it would be
Yeah,
several episodes long, of course.
yeah.
But to understand that he's saying you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. So just even looking at the name again, according to the order of the King of Righteousness, which is the Lord himself. And so in
Hmm.
some way, God is speaking over Jesus here, both before it happens and as it happens and after it has happened, that you are a priest forever according to my line. No longer is it, and please, I'm going to see him one day, so I know it's not with disrespect. I say that no longer is it the order of Aaron and the Levitical priesthood, that there is that, if anything, was a type and shadow that could meet us where we were. God wanted so much more for us, but at that time, the Hebrews were, and these are the Lord's words, stiff necked, rebellious, turning away from him and constantly choosing other gods. And so, in some way, the priesthood of Aaron, the Levitical priesthood, is meant to be, how do I want to say that? It's meant to meet us where we're at.
A tutor.
Well, yes, exactly. It's a governor and a tutor for when we are at a time perceptually and in our heart position that we can't grasp the fullness of who God is and what he's done. We need something more tangible. And again, we see it in Exodus. They get to the mountain and they're like, all right, can someone be our king now? Like they're still so old minded that they need a person to lead them because they physically can't lead themselves. And that's not, of course, the Lord's vision for Israel or for us. And so, to give an insight into that, I think by telling Jesus that you're a priest forever according to this order, according to the highest of the high, there is nothing greater than this because Melchizedek didn't need an introduction. He didn't, it doesn't say anything about the clothes he was wearing. It doesn't say anything about where he came from and wearing jewelry. It says he just walked out and brought forth the bread and the wine. The bread and the wine, you mean like communion? You mean like Jesus on the Last Supper,
Yeah.
indoctrinating them into this order? And so again, it's all sort of connected to me. And I don't want to just endlessly sort of give this dissertation, but I really want to hammer home the point that this is more than just a new being, it's a new way of being that being. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. And that is exactly, as you study out Melchizedek, what is being uh, reiterated. And
Mm-hmm.
as we, it's in, as we just recently talked about, we are a new creation. It's just very, like you said earlier, just very cool that
Mm-hmm.
we're a new creation in a new order of things. So this is this is how it is.
Yeah, exactly.
And I thought of this, and we'll probably get into it a little bit more with the other scriptures, but like you had mentioned the order of Aaron, up
Mm,
until this point, as the Lord is creating a nation for the first time through Abram,
hmm
um, there is part of the nation of Israel, and the 12 sons, uh, they priests come from one line
Hmm.
and kings come from another line.
Hmm.
Kings
Levi
come
and Judah,
from,
just for the two tribes
yeah,
for people's uh,
yeah.
following along.
So just that's another thing that will is foreshadowing a change in. But
Yes, yes,
yeah.
absolutely. And I know that, as we always find, we could go a lot longer and just say even more about this. So I suppose we'll keep moving it right along so that we can get to that point which you're talking about. Um, so we've covered two of the mentions, and in fact, I should say the only two that are in what we know as the Old Testament. There's the mention in Genesis and the mention in Psalms, and that's it for Melchizedek. And that's kind of funny in the Bible, just to be a one-off mention, in at least in something of this magnitude, I'll say. And so we're reintroduced in the New Testament in the letter from Paul to the Hebrews, where, again, for a little bit of context, Paul was Paul was like the equivalent of a Carl Sagan of his time. He was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, a teacher of teachers. He understood the law to the letter, followed it according to his word to the letter, and was so learned that he felt justified in the persecution of the Christians because of how much he knew. And so his letter to the Hebrews is after he has come to know Christ, all that knowledge isn't gone, but he now sees all that same knowledge through a different lens. And so this letter to the Hebrews is basically the entirety of the letter is, hey guys, look at this new lens that I'm looking through. But
Yeah.
this section specifically where he mentions Melchizedek, it's chapters 5 through 7, introduces it in 5, touches on it in 6, and then in 7 goes into great depth. Again, for any gematria fans out there, he mentions Melchizedek 8 times specifically in just this letter to the Hebrews. So the number 10 is like the perfect law, perfect completion in that way. 7 is its own completion, but 10 kind of represents a different aspect of completion. And then 8 represents new beginnings. So you have 7 days in a week, it's closed. And then the first day of the next week is number 8. And I think that that is kind of ominous, if you will. Now, I know ominous sort of has a negative connotation, but ominous in the sense that he mentions it 7 times and then mentions the eighth one, sort of sending us off out into the world. Like, all
Mm.
right, now go start your new beginning in this order. But he brings it up. And again, I don't need to necessarily read every one because several of them are the same. But this is in Hebrews chapter 5. And I'll start with the first sentence of chapter 5 and then kind of skip through so that I can cover Melchizedek. The first sentence: every high priest chosen from among mortals is put in charge of things pertaining to God on people's behalf, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with the ignorant and the wayward, since he himself is subject to weakness, and because of this, he must offer sacrifice for his own sins as well as for the people. And one does not presume to take this honor, but takes it only when called by God, just as Aaron was. Verse 5: so also, Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but was appointed by the one who said to him, you are my son, today I have begotten you. For as he says in another place, you are a priest forever, according to the order of Melchizedek. So that's the quoting Psalms right there. In fact, both of those are from Psalms. And so He's sort of laying some of the groundwork as he talks to the Hebrews without sort of diving in with both feet, laying the groundwork that Jesus was the one to whom all of these things were addressed in the Psalms, in the Proverbs, in the Old Testament, in Torah and Scripture. Jesus is the one it's pointing to. And yet he did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest. You don't take that role and say, I'm going to do this. You get called into that role,
Mm,
which, to your point, that's part of the reason for that type and shadow of the line of Levi is there doesn't have to be any question about it. If you're born into the family of Levi, you know exactly what you're going to do. You go be a priest. And I
hmm.
think that that's funny because then we look at ourselves today, and especially on the earth. I mean, shoot, you and I were talking about it this morning. The question that plagues my generation, but the earth right now, what do I do? What do I do
Mm.
with my time? What do I do with my life? Well, if you'll have it, you've been born into this order. So what you are is a priest. It's like back then, if you would have been born into Levi, this is what you're born into. Well, now that you're born into Jesus, this is what you're born into. You did not appoint yourself. You did not do it to glorify yourself. In fact, you were born into this line because God knew putting you in here would glorify Him ultimately. What
Mm.
better invitation to walk into your new man than knowing that about your calling before you even set foot on the earth? You know,
Well, having to do with that also, just a thought,
please.
as in the order of, you were talking about priest, but what about in the order of kings?
Mm,
If, imagine, we don't have much royalty left on the planet,
hmm.
but imagine knowing you were born into as a king. Those kids never doubt that they're kings, right? I mean, think about the
Totally.
royal family in the UK is really the only one we know a lot about. But
Right.
um, you think of William and Harry, they never doubted that they
Right.
were royalty, right?
Right.
I
Exactly.
don't know. I just think of the same thing. It just
Well, and what's
we can't
funny,
really understand that today,
mhm,
especially in the Western world. But we were born into royalty and we were
yes.
born into priesthood when we are born
Yes.
again.
Yeah,
So,
that's it's fantastic. And again, the I love this example. I can't remember who said it, but just to sort of paint the extremes of that royalty that you're talking about. Let's say you were born into the royal family in England, and around your 18th birthday, you just think to yourself, gosh, I don't really feel that royal. I don't think I'm royal. I don't think I'm that royal. Well, on your 18th birthday, the government is still going to show up and give you your inheritance.
yeah.
They're still going to send you the check. They're still going to move you into that house that's on the countryside. They're still going to respond to you as though you are. And so I think it's brilliant what you said because so much, frankly, of what we've talked about throughout all these episodes, but so much of what the gospel of Jesus is trying to combat is our own self-limiting beliefs, our
Yeah.
own view and perception of us, that there really is almost this psychological neuroplasticity way of saying that if you're always this thing and you're trying to become something else, you'll always hold on to the fact that I'm this. And so Jesus has done that for us, become this thing. He has become our righteousness. Funny that we're talking about Melchizedek at the same time. He has become for us that righteousness. And ironically, it's our holding on to another narrative, holding on to another belief that we have invested more of ourself in that we're still experiencing another truth other than the one he's spoken, not because what he said isn't true, but because what we perceive to be true about ourselves often takes precedence in the way we experience things. And that's why, again, we talk about he's given us free will. He's given us free will. If you want to believe that you're not royal and you're not anything, then you can believe that. You're wrong, but you can believe it, and yet you'll experience life that way. So are you wrong in air quotes? And so I think in that same way, as we start to understand and recognize the fullness of not just what Jesus has done for us, but to us, part of that is that you're now in this order. You
Mm-hmm.
are part of this priesthood on the one hand, but the kingship on the other. You
Mm-hmm.
are Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, who is the king of peace in Salem. You are in that order now. And the only thing that's different between you and Jesus is that he's the high priest. So in all manners, it ends up going up the ladder to him. But you're still in that priesthood. So again, I
Love,
digress.
love it.
Um, like I said, I want to be conscious of time here. A lot of what's mentioned about Melchizedek is that verse in Psalms repeated. And I think Paul does that in an effort to say, look, it's right here. It's in the scriptures. It's right here. We're not making this up. But a couple of the things that I have highlighted in Hebrews chapter 6, um, verse 13 starts a new paragraph. And the subtitle of that paragraph is The Certainty of God's Promise. And part of that, what Paul talks about is God can't lie. And now that he's sworn on himself, he's doubled down on the fact that he can't lie. And he finishes this thought by saying, Jesus, a forerunner on our behalf, has entered, having become a high priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. Then in chapter 7, it really starts to do a deep dive. In the sake of time, I'm going to leave that deep dive to all of our readers. Just go read Hebrews chapter 7 and see how well Paul articulates more than what I could articulate about this notion of the order and what Melchizedek represents. But the verse that I want to focus on specifically is um, in chapter 7, verse 12, when it's talking about uh, another priest arising according to the order of Melchizedek rather than the one according to the order of Aaron. Verse 12 says, For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. And so Jesus was very clear in the Sermon on the Mount in saying, until all heaven and earth passes away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter from the law will be done away with. And yet, he also says, a new commandment I give you today. So it's not that the entire law that the Lord set out through Moses is false. It's that we as humans often misinterpret the law as what we should behave like in order to become righteous. And Jesus came and flipped that on its head and says, the new law is that you are righteous. Now behave accordingly. And what he
Mm.
says is, here's the new commandment I give you: love God with all your heart and love each other as I have loved you. So, this new commandment sums up the entirety of what the law was trying to say, in that you are love. And so I think that's the point that I'd like to leave people with as we talk about Melchizedek. There is, we love, worship, and serve a triune God. He is three in one. And so Melchizedek is righteousness. He's the king of Salem, which is peace. And the thing that's missing, so to speak, is love. And we learn from John's letters, I think it's first or second John, he says God is love. So if in that very first introduction to Melchizedek that we got in Genesis, where he says, I am a priest of the Most High, he's saying, my name is Melchizedek, the king of righteousness. I come from Salem, the king of peace, and I serve love. So
Mm.
it's this is the triune being that we have been pulled into. And the only thing that's missing is our continued invested belief in that truth to see it manifest more and more than we have up to this point. But I know I've
Mm.
been talking a boatload this episode. What would you like to leave us with?
Well, well, first of all, yeah, can't really top that. That was beautiful, beautifully put. But in Revelation 1, 6, we, the sons of God, are called kings and priests. So
Mm,
as we step into our new creation in Jesus, who is a king and a priest of the in the order of Melchizedek,
hmm
we too are kings and priests.
mm,
And so I just think that that is a beautiful way to articulate what we're stepping into, the inheritance we step into when we step into our new creation in Jesus. But
agreed. Well,
also,
and
oh, go ahead.
no, please.
Well, I love this Psalm 85:10, where mercy and truth meet together, righteousness and peace kiss each other.
Mm,
I
it's
just love
beautiful.
that.
Well, it's funny actually that that's a sort of a perfect point to send us off because you had brought up earlier that, you know, beforehand, kings and priests came from two different families. And that was on purpose. If you want to say a preempt to the United States, it was the separation of power. It's the
Mm-hmm.
recognition of our sin nature and our broken hearts that getting power like that as a king is one thing, getting power like that as a priest is one thing. Imagine the brokenness of them being one and the same. And so, as we've walked through history where we are and we're in the world today in 2024, we see how important it is in the fallen world that we live in to have the separation of those two orders of power. And so part of what I think it's beautiful that is alive to you, you keep coming back to the fact that in Jesus, that doesn't need to happen anymore. They don't need to be separated because the humility of Jesus and the love of Jesus and the mercy and compassion of Jesus far outweighs any notions of power, any
Mm.
ideas of being in charge and sort of setting the way. I think that, you know, as we recognize that we've been called into this, part of leaving our old nature behind is why in all four of the gospels it made it in there when they ask him about true greatness and they're arguing amongst themselves who's greater,
Mm.
who's going to be the highest. Jesus tells them that his entire kingdom is backwards. The first will be last, the highest will be the lowest. This child on my lap is going to be the greatest. And so it's this invitation to forsake our earthly notions, what I want to call the Gentile ranking system of king up here, serf down here, that in the Lord's kingdom, the high priest, the one who sits at the right hand of the Father, came and took on flesh and washed the feet of those who were about to betray him. That's what it means to be in this order. And so, as we recognize this new order that we've been called into, it is different from the power structures we see in the world where we want to lord that power over each other. To be in this order means to be like Melchizedek in the very first time we're introduced to him. Abram is the main character. Melchizedek walks in, gives him food and wine, blesses him, and then goes on his way. That's what it is to be like Jesus in this order. You're not here to be served by the manifestations on earth of power, of things, of materials. You're here to come in and bless those who are walking without God in their life. Because again, he wasn't Abraham yet, he was Abram. Even though he knew the Lord and was doing this because the Lord had
Yeah.
called him, that your job as a priest in this order is to come in and serve, to make yourself humble, to be lower, to lift others up so that they can be the main character in their own walk before God.
Mm, yeah.
All right, my friends, we'll talk to you next time.
Blessings.